In this lecture on households, populations, and complex socio-environmental systems, Dr. Eduardo Brandizio uses the example of the Brazilian Amazon to describe the increasing complexity and connectivity of the modern globalized world. He first overviews a range of theoretical perspectives that focus on different scales of change, and notes that analytical frameworks are distinct from theories and can incorporate multiple levels of analysis. He highlights the role of comparative, longitudinal, and cross-sectional analysis to work over time and space. He then describes household change and agricultural modernization in Brazil, as well as forest farms in the Amazon and the ways that global popularity of acai fruit can change management decisions at the local scale. He highlights as well increasing urbanization and the nature of collective action decision-making as communities migrate and consolidate. He ends with the notion of islands of landscape governance to describe indigenous forest reserves and the emerging regional complexity and connectivity of these landscapes. He summarizes these new research areas as still situated in old discourses, but also requiring new analytical frameworks.
You see the title of my presentation, and what I'm going to try to do here is to reflect with you. It's not a canned presentation. I'm going to try to reflect with you and take you through kind of a trajectory of studying a region that has been transforming really fast. So take an approach a little bit different than Monique's, in the sense that I'll be very pluralistic in terms of theory and see how I have reached to different theoretical bodies to deal with different questions in a region that has been transforming really fast. It's a tricky presentation because it's sort of a mosaic of dozens of projects and papers. So I'm going to try to give you a thread going from the household level work that I do to my more recent research on understanding regional complexity, right? So don't expect to have a full explanation of each slide or each part of it. They are part of a story, and I hope you go with me along that story in the reflection that I'm doing rather than in a presentation of a particular point of view and so forth. So I'm going to cover three sets of examples that I organize in this particular order. One is the transformation of households, which has been sort of the core of my interest and the core of my work. And the perspective that I get at that level actually informs the other two levels in a major way. So my entry point to most of the work that I have done in the Amazon has been the work at the level of households. But over time, as you're going to see, my work is start to deal as much with sub-regional processes and regional processes and regional analysis, most of the time in collaborative teams with colleagues on a variety of disciplines, right? So I showed this figure yesterday, the figure of the great global acceleration, and this is the latest publication of that figure, which is just last year, right? The first version of this figure was in 2004. It was a very important landmark in global change research. What this figure adds is that it disaggregates the acceleration in terms of OECD countries, BRIC countries, and other countries, right? And what you start to see there is that you have a change in the global distribution of impact in terms of all those indicators, from population change to economic indicators and so forth. And on your right, what you have is what I call the Great Amazonia Acceleration, right? It's how a region like the Amazon reflects these global processes of economic and political economic processes, right? Now, the point that I have this figure there, of course, is to make a connection between the region and the lives of people on the ground with a much bigger global history of transformation, right? But there's another point that is part of that reflection that I mentioned to you at the beginning. How do you understand a region that changes every month, right? When you take one perspective and when you get to grasp a particular process, with a particular set of conceptual tools, you come back, the variables change, the process change, the dynamics change it. And rarely we have in our conceptual models ways in which we follow that change or have the tools to follow the change in the accelerated pace in which they have. So just to illustrate, very briefly, the Amazon has been, I would say, I call it a microcosm of the Anthropocene, but it has been one of the biggest laboratories of central policies in global commodity expansions, right? And the region has been transforming so fast from this national and global process, but also from the ground up. And I just put, 4 assorted elements of that transformation here. Of course, the urban, which still is, in spite of the dominant feature, one of the most invisible features of the Amazon, being in development discussions, being in climate change negotiations. Communications, and I find fascinating that map of cell phone towers and how it has changed the nature of the lives of people on the ground. Road networks and transportation and the connectivity that has, is transforming as we speak the Amazon. And one of the most impressive transformation is the territorialization of local indigenous and local population rights, as well as conservation. Like in less than 2 decades, we went from a single-digit percentage of the territorial part of the region as assigned to particular kinds of governance, mostly with indigenous and local populations, to 44% today. So the region and the governance of the region is on the hands most of the time of local populations that are increasingly aside of responsibility of governing and managing the region in terms of resources, commodities, and more carbon. Now, before I get to the ground, and for much of the time, and it's still today, a lot of the discussion and a lot of the explanation of how do you understand the transformation of the Amazon has been one that I call one of structural determinism. And it has predominant, if you look at most of those indicators from land use patterns to deforestation, in particular to explaining demographic trends, economic development or the lack of economic development and urbanization trends, you're going to find an explanation that goes back usually through central planning or to global markets or to national policies or to global environmental pressures. So one of the things that you come across when you see a region that is transforming fast is that, yeah, you can explain a lot of what's happening there, or until a point you could explain significantly what has been happening there, because the region was sort of a blank slate, if you will, in a period of military dictatorship and in periods of expansion of neoliberal policies. So in a lot of ways, the region was subjected in many ways through the forces of central planning. And it would explain a lot, even at a local level, on the responses to those particular input and what kinds of processes they trigger and what kinds of changes they promote. Now, the argument that I start working on and base it on working on many sites in the regions and mostly works that I, longitudinal kind of work, is that we reach at a point where those kinds of explanation could not explain anymore the heterogeneity of responses and the emerging patterns of responses that you would see at a sub-regional level, right? And the argument that I've been developing in this sense is that the region has gone through what I'm calling here state shift, to use a complexity language perspective. Meaning, there's a point at which the developments that I've showed you in previous pictures have been taking place, they created a different situation in which the spread of a particular force, if you will, would not respond linearly anymore to as it did before, right? And there are many ways of, I'm still working, this is part of a book project that I'm working on. There are many ways that you can define when that state shift has happened. And to me, it's at the end of the 1980s that coincides with the rewriting of the Brazilian Constitution, right? And that particular rewriting creates conditions that we do not have time to go on here, but that impacts both the rights of local populations, environmental issues, and the creation of municipalities. Right? So that process created a legal framework in which it triggered a very large transformation. For instance, the number of municipalities in the region following that period, increased not increased. If you look at the municipalities today, formed today, about 60% of them were formed after this period. Right? So a subdivision of the political administrative system there. Now, there are many other features. So you have, of course, the beginning of a number of structural adjustment programs at the beginning of the 1990s. You have the continued expansion of roads. You have China coming into play and pushing an incredible commodity market that Brazil still rides today. And a number of social policies of different kinds of cash transfer programs and other things that really shaped the social landscape in the lives of people in the region, among other things, right? So the argument that I'm making here is that there is a shift in which the region has passed, in which the tools that we have to explain are not enough to capture the dynamic that is taking place on the ground and at a sub-regional level, and at a regional level, right? So before I get to the field yet, one of the things that I've been working there for a long time on a variety of processes, and I put this slide following our discussion of theory yesterday. And when I look back at my work and my publications and so forth, I actually look with a lot of satisfaction of how open I've been to try to look for tools, explicit or implicitly, that would help us to address different particular kinds of problems. And those are some of the problems that I've been working on for a long time. Household economy, household land use change, family life cycles, ethnobotanical knowledge, institutional arrangements. A variety of issues that when a number of tools have helped me to understand them mostly at a particular level or related to a very specific issue or a very specific set of variables, right? So they offer you, and we have access to all those tools, but when you're confronted in a situation of where change is accelerated and connectivity becomes the driver of the process, and complexity in its most basically sense, you don't find the tools that allows you to capture those processes. You become undermined by or you're trying to fit a complex problem into a conceptual tool that does not offer you the instruments that you have. But they offer a lot other things, right? Now, when you try, and this is part of my own process of moving, in trying to explain, what I was looking on the ground, which I'll show examples shortly, to make a reading of the transformation of the region and a reading of development of the region, which is my interest. One understanding, have a dialogue about development or about underdevelopment in this region. You also find a number of theoretical tools or conceptual tools or whatever you want to call it. I am just listing few here that I have used or tried to use or tried to adapt in the sense of helping me to make a case, to interpret a problem that would supersede my study site or supersede a region that I know and can describe very well, and be applied in different parts of the region, right? So I could show examples of all kinds of frameworks that have been adapted to different problems, and they all offer fantastic tools to do it. And if you look back, and here I put from Stewart to Frederick Bars to Sue and Giddens, among others. It's really interesting, and I'll go back to my comment yesterday, that I think the social science had a arrested project of social complexity. And when I look back, and I have my personal interest in understanding historically how those things have thinking have evolved, you go to Frederick Bars, and you see that I'm going to use a lot of elements from his early work that he called the generative model to explain emergence of patterns in different parts of the world from his work on kinship. Very sophisticated analysis of emerging complexity that we basically forgot about it today. You know, Stewart that I showed yesterday, I'm not standing by the approach that he proposed in 1953, but he offered a number of elements for us to think about how local units of decision and livelihood intersect with national and larger scale processes. Anthony Giddens, of course, I think perhaps the most developed idea in his structuration theory and the duality of structure approach, in which he tries to bridge those two dimensions that we got stuck on in the social science and elsewhere of agency and structure, right? And you either come from one side or you come from the other side, and we're still trying to find ways out of it, right? And in fact, I like to use a comment that Bruno Latour made in his reflection of actor network theory, which he says something like, you know, it's, we have like the ad infinitum dissatisfaction of a social scientist. Because when we look at a solution at one level, when you look at a problem, when you find a solution at one level and you find it that is not sufficient, you go to another level and try to find a response there. And then when you find at another level and it's not sufficient, you go back to that local level to try to find it. And so then he comments on something like, you know, it's that circulating entity that makes the social process, not structure or agency at all. So great comment, but we do not have the tools to make that bridge, right? So I think there's a really interesting theoretical problem here that regions like the Amazon, in which you can see and document the process of transformation, can help us to understand the elements that may come to play in a better, I think, articulation of concepts and theories that help us to understand the kinds of dilemmas and collective problems that we live. So outlining a number of sites there. I don't do research in all those sites. I've done research very on the ground on 3 of those sites, most on the eastern part. Other sites are areas where my students have worked and areas where I collaborate with other colleagues who work on the ground, right? So my examples here are very choppy and sort of I picked just particular examples to show illustration from some of these areas. So I'm going to build a story here going from processes at the household level to regional interpretation, right? My entry point, and that's my main interest then and my main interest now, although it has changed in nature, is understand the lives of small farmers. It's been sort of from a personal story to an interest of understanding Brazil through the transformation of the rural and the families and the position of the families has been to me the way of understanding a region like the Amazon. And that's what you get, what you get to do that from a longitudinal perspective is perhaps the most productive part of doing the anthropological work in the sense of working from the experience of people and how they have coped and what questions they ask at different phases of their lives. So just like Monique was saying yesterday, I've seen the kids having kids along the same families, right? And actually some of the questions that I asked today are about those kids because they have an expectation of life that is totally different than the expectation of their parents. But they also have an agency that is completely different than their parents. So in this particular region, which is Marajó Island, it's the oldest colonial region of the Amazon. It's still, in this half of the eastern half of the island, the area of the largest landed concentration that comes from colonial times in Brazil. And in this region, when I got there, one of the things that most struck me, we've seen we studied liberation theology projects for many years. They shaped that region and the ideologies of liberation theology projects. As you see, global markets and how they came to play a role as we are starting the work there, and then conditional cash transfers and multi-locality, a number of processes, right? But when I start, just to go back to my point there, when I start to work there, what called most attention to me in my beginning was very much a cultural ecology frame, trying to understand adaptive strategies of different communities. But the most important aspect to me at that time, in the first few kind of meetings and interviews that I did, was the role of land tenure in the way people were subjugated to absentee owners in an incredible way. So when you start to talk with a family that is the third generation of sharecroppers and almost crying because they're going to be expelled because the new owner is the son of the absentee owner, wants a different project, that shapes the way you see that particular force in the way it informs your understanding. So for a long time, a lot of the emphasis that I put was on land tenure. All my comparative questions were land tenure this, land tenure that, how that influenced this or that. It was a very important part of the process to me. As it evolves, and I do geospatial analysis and historical landscape analysis a lot, what you start to see already is a more complex picture of many other variables, including development projects, different perspectives of communities, different leaderships in communities, sort of many other variables that you look at different communities. These are just reference to 6 communities in this case. You see very different responses, very different patterns for the same issue. So if you hold land tenure, you're going to see other variables come to play to explain some of the changes. Slowly, the tools to understand what I was trying to understand, what is shaping the life of people here, how they respond to the external forces that are around them. It started to gain a different perspective. I had to reach the different ideas, different processes, different variables, and so forth. And the most interesting part of it was the globalization of the acai fruit. Acai has been, sort of a conduit for my work for 20-some years now. I studied acai in every aspect you can imagine. In the globalization of acai, wrote a book about it. There's we're not graduate students. When we talk about graduate students, when I started to work with acai, I said, I'm going to study this little fruit, such a small thing, but the globalization of that little fruit opened the way for me to understand all the other processes that I was hoping to understand. Because it put farmers into a global chain with competing actors, with many other forces that would give you a glimpse of the problems and the way they have to react to those problems. So I studied acai and the globalization process of acai, which took me methodologically a very different turn than I originally have. This is the beginning of the 1990s. And my original very localized study of different communities took a very different shape. Both, I studied what they do, I studied their knowledge, I studied their management, all those things. But actually what I had to do was to find a way to study the market and to follow that market to understand how do they fit themselves into that larger market. To give an idea is that one of the key points, and I put this slide first to show that acai is based on a local management, agroforestry management, that it makes a forest in different kinds of techniques to become a very intensive production system. Very intensive production system in terms of production of calories and so forth. But it maintains a forest. And what you see below in our patches of acai, very intensively managed acai, in maps, both showing that, or not showing, but in this whole region, the whole Amazon Delta estuary, you have a transition to forest. to a forest economy when everything else in the Amazon was going through a huge deforestation process, right? And acai start being produced, everywhere along the Amazon. Now, the point here, and this was sort of, a lot of my dissertation was about it at the time, was how do we see producers and how do we see productive land? The concept of productive land that underlines the idea of development was one of the things that I found, one of the knots that I found here that I had to dedicate myself. And the story is that a lot of the social categories in which the people that I work with is that of extractivist. And that's a broad social category used in the Amazon, in many cases by communities to claim land rights. And it has a long history with the history of the rubber economy and other economies in the Amazon. Now, the social category of extractivist puts one in a position of a passive actor in a regional economy. I have many quotes and many, of course, evidence of this in the way that as the new actors come into a booming economy, the way they reinforce the position of the producer, I call him the producer here, of the extractivist, as needing help from the external forces to intensify, to respond, to create an economy that is rational. And I use these images to play how do we see and how that affects the way we interpret people and landscape and the presence of people and landscape. So if you take the conventional category of acai fruit as an extractivist system, meaning the forest is out there, you go there and collect when the fruit is ready, right? You have a region in which you say it's a forest region, native forest, in which you don't see a productive, intensive land use economy. So you don't see the producers, and you don't see the transformation that they make on the landscape. If you differentiate, and I did a lot of work on remote sensing here, differentiating the intensive agroforestry managed acai from the unmanaged forest. So suddenly what you have is that the producer who is invisible in the landscape, if you look at as an extractivist, becomes the most important economic actor on the landscape. Anyhow, just in that's the favorite part of the story for me, because it got me into a dialogue about how social categories in the Amazon intersect with development and the implications of that. Because as extractivists, you don't have property rights, you don't have rights to credit, you don't have recognition of what you do. So I start following the chain, the commodity chain, understand how that impacts their return, the overall economy, and start to look at the economic return of the acai fruit as it enters into a global market and is transformed in different phases. And this is outdated. I made a new estimation for that a few years ago. But just from that, which was some years ago, you see the value of the same amount of fruit when it leaves the farm gate to when you buy it here, it's 70 to 100% higher, right? So very little of that stays or goes back to the local economy where the resources generated. Jumping another part here, what happened is that you have a very active economy. You have a billion-dollar economy. People participating widely with their own techniques, making it possible. But you have more than ever a dependence on cash transfer programs. The economy, even the most successful economy, with the most inclusive sort of, most inclusive of producers, right? And with a high market value, high market value, does not overcome the other structural problems that the people live in. So you see only 20% of the families in this region can live off the acai production. Most others depend on some kinds of cash transfer programs. along this process, you have a lot of changes. You have changes in transportation, you have changes in communication, you have changes in electricity, and most important, perhaps, you have changes in the way people think and what they want. And what happened is that what we start to study, and just from the observation, is the emergence of these multi-sited households, as we call it. Meaning households that organize themselves both in the rural area and the urban area, but function as a unit in terms of economic decision. And we start mapping, using very basic social network mapping, the distribution of families between those areas. And what we found was interesting that families have more members in their local town or the capital than they have in other rural communities around them. A new dynamic. That process has implications. So the urban transformation that process creates, and here's the transformation of because people want to go to urban areas, they want to have education, they want to have fun, but they also want security, having a little house where the family can go, right? And what happened is that you have an incredibly fast transformation of urban areas in the region. And the municipalities do not have the resource to provide for that transformation. So there's an increasing disparity between the amount of service demanded or needed and the ability of municipalities to provide those services. And there are many other consequences to that, and I'll just highlight a few. This is a very recent project that we've been studying. What are the consequences for the populations who move to urban areas? And in this case, it's the state capital that is now 2.5 million people with the surrounding area. And the largest amount of people, and these are census sectors that we've been doing modeling and field work on census sectors to see how income, house conditions, infrastructure, access to sewage, and so forth intersect in creating vulnerability in areas that are subjected to flooding, right? So what you have is this reality, I'm not talking about violence, which is another big part of this, a reality of cities that do not have the infrastructure in this situation of increasing pollution in areas that are very vulnerable to flooding. These are photos from residents of an increasing situation of frequent flooding and higher flooding, and flooding that cross with sewage, right? So you have that situation, and that's present throughout cities in this particular region, which is the Amazon. We've been studying the same process, which is the way the riverine farmers are responding to changing tides and flooding and climate change related factors. And what is interesting is that what you see is a repertoire of a lot of knowledge in terms of detecting when they expect different tides. This particular region is a region that governed by tides, very high tides. And so we've been doing this study of local knowledge about perception of change in tides and responses to change in terms of crop pattern and residence, to understand how the rural side of this area is responding to the changes that are also affecting the urban sites. But what you have, and here I'm putting the urban and the riverine, what you have now, it's an emerging, a different kind of collective action problem emerging. And we see that very recently, meaning you have such an amount of sewage and pollution and industrial pollution. You see the white river here from mining processing plants that now affect fisheries and fishermen in the local village, right? So you have that collective action problem that is emerging that was not present there. People would deal with other fishermen on their own kinds of common pool resource issues, but now they have a different level of challenge in terms of to breach. Just to put one framework there, at least, which we've been working very recently, we're trying to adapt the institutional analysis framework, in terms of understanding collective dilemmas to that particular kind of situation. How do we interpret? This is very new to us. It's sort of just developing conceptually how this would work. But how do we interpret a collective action problem that is based on the connectivity of cities upstreams with fishermen's downstreams. And what elements do we need to think, when we apply collective action thinking to that kind of problem? Not to community-based problem, but to problems that are multi-level. So just to share I'm going to jump here to we're going, you already saw going from households to urban areas or multi-sited households is sort of the interpretation of that process. But in other regions, the work has taken, because of the nature of the regions, is to understand, how communities are formed in areas where you have agrarian settlements that families come separately. And that's a really interesting part, because away from the region that you were seeing just minutes ago, these regions are the road highways of the region, where you have the bulk of the population moving in, creating new forms of organization and in new forms of territorial arrangements, right? So in one of the regions that we've been working, you map the property regime's evolution over time, in this case from 74 to 2010, and what you see is a complex mosaic of territorial governance, each one guided by very different expectations about what you need to govern, how you should govern, and so forth. And that is to give you a sense of how those particular arrangements in an area of colonization, so we're going from the Amazon Delta to the roadways of the Amazon, you start to see this configuration of different property regimes and arrangements. Now, the other side of it, if you continue on that continuum, are the indigenous areas. And these are work I've been doing with colleagues. One of the papers was actually part of the readings, where we are kind of documenting and explaining this phenomena that we're calling the formation of islands of conservation and governance. But the point that we are making here is that this has been the most successful and very important response to the expansion of everything else in the Amazon, or the commodity markets in the Amazon, has been the government expansion to, or response to, grant land rights and to create environmental protected areas that balance everything else that is taking place in the region. Our point is that this is limiting and has already come to a limit in most of the region. In part because you form these islands. These islands are part of interconnected watersheds. And the impact circulates through watersheds, what we call functional interdependence, right? So a governance system that functions well at one level cannot deal with the problems that happen at another level. And that's the dilemma of most of the southern part of the Amazon today. It's a governance dilemma of a response that was fast, it was effective in some way to a point, it has now reached the limit. Another area where we're hopefully going to get a grant to work on, this gives you a sense of how the idea of conservation that isolates governance regimes from the surroundings is limited. So what you have here, deforestation on the one side, fire events on the other side. And in the middle, you have about 5 different categories of reserves, both indigenous and traditional populations, basically surrounded, right? So just in terms of pressure, if you look closely, you're going to find a lot of illegal markets. You're going to find a lot of circulation between rural and urban, a much more complex picture than is here. And the responses to that problem, in the absence, I would say, of a response that looks into the connectivity of those governance systems, is a response on the ground. So I find really interesting this Washington Post, very recent analysis of this militia process that is emerging among indigenous populations to defend from illegal loggers in this case, but from other invaders too. Right? So you have a local level response. This is a manifestation that we took part a few years ago against the soybean expansion in that particular region. And below, in fact, is an initiative, which that paper describes, of the indigenous groups to reach out to the farmers and municipalities outside of their reserves to deal with reforestation of the waterways that will lead to the reserves, right? Because they're getting all the impact inside, even though their borders are protected. And what's happening now, and this is a new project that we're starting, is the urban part of it. So you have attention to this, of course, and I show some attention to the urban area, but the urban dynamic that is actually shaping this region has been totally off the conversation. When I was at COP21, for instance, and I went to many forums of discussions related to the Amazon, 99% were about carbon-related forums, and some about conservation. There's not a single mention, and many maps did not have a point showing where cities are in the Amazon. We're talking about 784 cities. And if you look at these points here, those reserves are surrounded by cities. And the networks of cities that sort of guide the process of transformation of the region. So that's what we're going to study now, is the evolution of, this co-evolution of urban networks and how they play out regionally and how they play out on the ground. We have colleagues working in each one of those areas, and I work in some of those areas too. So, kind of putting things back together in that process of trying to think about a regional interpretation. My own exercise, in a very limited way, I would say, has been to first start to connect the dots of the processes that I've been documenting on the ground. And what kinds of changes are important at each level that stand out to me as helping us to understand how the thing is evolving from those interactions, right? And here's just a list of things that over time to me became very important components of this explanation of understanding the transformation of the region. So from individual preference and choice, either to migrate or to choose a particular land use, to intergenerational change, into family life cycles, and I'm not going to go through all of that, but I see an interconnection between those processes. And what we don't have is a conceptual frame to interconnect them very well, right? I'm sorry, that's my own reflection here on the struggle to get to that. In previous exercise with colleagues that are urbanists and demographers, we're able to capture the urban part of it. And I think we did really well in modeling and going from the very local level process and data that is household data and community level data that is illustrated here in levels. I mean, how do households relate to cities? And how community formation creates the cities of near urban centers? And then how those urban centers enter into a network of urban centers? And then which ones emerge in that hierarchy to become centers of reference in particular parts of the region, if you follow my idea here. So it's, this paper was on the hierarchy of urban areas in the Amazon and how it's forming a hierarchy and the implications of that hierarchy to shape the network that is configuring the region today. This is the same project. So kind of to end, I guess. I showed at the beginning those different levels and how different kinds of theories or concepts and ideas help me to understand the specific problems. And I don't have a solution. But in looking back, in looking into the works, and here comes a lot of material from Frederick Barrs. No one has talked about his work on generative model to think about the emergence of complex systems, for instance. Giddens and others, in which, I mean, those terms are very general. I would have to unpack each one of you why they make sense to me, right? But the overall idea is that interplay, I mean, building on the Giddens idea of the duality of structures, of that interplay that at each point creates new structures in their own sense. So that's the beginning of a formulation that I'm hoping to develop in order to have what I think is a conversation about the region that is grounded on the complexity of the region. And that helps to move away from the structural determinism that tends to talk about the region just as a whole, in the sense of policy solutions as a whole, explanations as a whole, without paying attention to the heterogeneity of processes that you have inside, but also what is common to what shapes the overall region as a result of the interactions of those many factors, not as a result of single structural factors that have dominated the way the conversation has gone and the way policy has been formed. So just some keywords here that coevolution of those networks, and I think we need to think about the coevolution because there has been many responses and structures put on the ground, either on the indigenous, on the conservation areas, urban programs, agrarian systems, but not as much about how they are co-evolving and how one is shaping the other. Move the discussion of governance from single-level governance to bridging institutions. Most of the responses tend to be based on property regimes that are single-level. Very little effort is put into the connectivity of people along a particular watershed, for instance, that have very different social groups, very different perspectives to the region, and very different economic dynamics. The discussion of the persisting extractivist idea of development for the region. And I'll go far as much as saying that the carbon economy of the region follows that pattern. It's an economy of trying to keep carbon there in compensation schemes based on subsidies that has an importance, but it also cannot be dissociated from the opportunities for developing the region in a way that will solve its own problems. I show here some of the urban problems. We could go to many other dimensions there. And there are many structural limitations that are shaping that, both legal, fiscal, economic, and many other things that continue to be persistent and need to be addressed. So, it's sort of a way of contributing to a complex thinking perspective to deal with the complexity that the region has.